So that's the idea behind classical education. It's actually not new. We also take a look at the flip side. We could study antonyms of the word classic. One of the antonyms would be the word modern. And if you attach the word modern with the word education, then maybe, like me, you get a little bit of a shudder and a feeling of dread, because I don't know what this is going to do for our future. And another term we can look at is implicit. The word implicit has, like, it implies, or it gives an idea of, but a classical education isn't implicit, it's very clear. It's going to tell you exactly what it means and what we should be learning. So this evening then, what I'm going to talk about are like 4 areas then of classical education. The first one that we're going to do is we're going to review a brief history of the development of what I call classical education. Then we're going to look at the quadrivium and the trivium. Those are probably 2 of the most popular terms that we know, that those are the terms that come to mind. We're going to talk about pedagogy and what that means in a classical education. And then if we have time, we'll talk briefly about the humanities. So a brief history, we'll have to start at the very beginning. And if we go back to the very beginning, we don't actually have many texts. The few that we do have, though, are very, very important, even thousands of years after they've been written. One of the texts, one of the most important texts, as we all would agree, is the Bible. It is an ancient text. It was written down from the very beginning through to a certain point of time. Other texts that we have from ancient times is the Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey. The interesting thing about that, and even up until the time of Socrates, when Plato started writing down what he said, those were actually oral traditions, and things weren't really written down. So they're not really books as much as they are sort of oral epics, and they're meant to be sort of talked through in community. But these are very important texts that we have brought down to us through the generations. Then, of course, I mentioned already, Socrates is written by Plato. There's Aristotle, there's Euclid, there's the Greek myths. And I don't put any of those texts even close to the level of importance with the Bible. Like, the Bible's just going to be there. It's going to cover everything, all things throughout time. However, these other texts do hold an importance as ancient texts that we should read, and we should try to figure out what it was that they wanted to tell us. And the reason why is because just as God was revealing himself then to the people of Israel, that he was the God, the creator of the universe, at that time, he was also revealing to a certain degree things about the immaterial world to the Greeks. These were intelligent people. They were also made in the image of God. They knew there was a higher power and a greater God, but they couldn't actually access him. They couldn't reach him. They couldn't talk to him because he was not revealing himself to them. So what they discovered then in those times, and what they defined, was some ideas about the human body and soul and mind and how they work. And God did reveal to them some things about the immaterial world, but it was in a sense detached from him, but it was a longing for him, so what they discovered then was this meaning of reality and existence, and without God, that search, it wasn't a very honest search, but it wasn't God, it wasn't the spiritual revelation, but it was very foundational to the study of all reality and existence. Interestingly enough, in a classical education, it's important that you would study philosophy before you study theology. The reason why is because the philosophers, as I said, they have some foundational truths to reality, but they have some really, really quirky bad ideas. And so how can we tell? How do we know what we should be taking from them? And how do we know what's quirky and bad? Well, we know when we go to the gospel and we start to study what does the Bible say, and we take theology and we kind of lay that over what the philosophers were saying. And those things that come out and that speak out as truth, that resonate with the truth of the gospel, those are those things we can say, now this gives us a better insight into the humans and how we think. And I think in particular of the Socratic method, he defined 3 steps, if you will, to the way a human being will respond to an idea. The first step is when we start talking to someone, and I'm going to use the example here of what Jesus did when he told his disciples to go out into the world. He's instructed them using the Socratic method. He said to them, go out into the world and preach the gospel. Now, when you're talking to someone about Jesus at that time, those people would have been completely ignorant. Like, huh, what? That's the first process, right? You have to tell someone about this idea. Then there comes a point in every discussion, in every conversation, particularly about the gospel, where the person you're talking to needs to make a decision about what you're saying. So either they're going to accept their ignorance and say, there's something that you're telling me that has some truth to it and I need to know more, or they're going to say, don't know, don't care, go, right? And so Jesus told his disciples, and Socrates told his disciples as well, once you've spent time, you've spent time with this person, you've told them about this idea, they've accepted their ignorance, then they've made the decision to listen and to start learning. That's a time when you can actually start working with them and you move into the second phase. And it's almost like you're the midwife of the idea. You have to walk with them, you have to counsel them, you have to coach them. And it's like when a person becomes a new Christian, that can shatter your world. It turns everything upside down. And then go back to you and like, whoa, like these ideas, I like, how do I do this? How do I respond to this? And then you are that person that God has put with them to help them walk through that idea and to teach them more, to the point where they reach that third stage, where they're so confident and they believe it so much they can't help it, they have to go out and tell other people. That's kind of the progress that Jesus worked with his disciples. Now, the thing about the middle stage is not everyone is going to accept your idea. Not everyone is going to say, I want to know more, help me to understand. Some people are going to say, I don't, like, you're just a crazy person, go away. But what did Jesus say about that? What happens when you're in a town and they just refuse to listen? What do? You shake the dust off your feet, like, yes, shake the dust off your feet, and you go. Socrates said the same thing. When a person will not accept your idea, when they will not go, like, accept their ignorance and want to pursue a truth with you, there's nothing more you can do with them, and you need to just move on. So that's just an example that I'm bringing up, where when we look at the scriptures and we look at these philosophers, we can take that process, and Socrates goes on in length about that process. It's really beautiful, actually. And we can say, okay, there's something there. We can learn a lot about not only evangelizing, but about how we can communicate and share ideas with other people. So that's why we in a classical education, you study philosophy, and it would be at an older age, and then you study theology. That's not to confuse theology with biblical study. Biblical study is foundational, and it should be done constantly, all the time, the study of the Bible. But theology is the study of what do we believe about the Bible. Okay, so and we can also pair that with the Gospels, the way Paul did. In the New Testament, Paul will talk about, he goes to Greek and he is in the Areopagus and he talks about this unknown God. And so he ties in the theology and the understanding of who Jesus is and God is with the Greek philosophies of the day. And when he does that, he's tying in the understanding of mankind as a physical being and a spiritual being, and he's tying those things together. And he's using the wisdom of these men who were not enlightened by the Spirit and the wisdom of the Spirit itself. And by putting those things together, we can actually understand quite a lot of ourselves. One thing we can actually learn is that man is a microcosm of the universe. So what do I mean by that? We have bodies, and we are part of creation. We, like the animals, we are attached to the earth. We grow, we thrive, we survive off what the earth produces. But that's not all, because when God created us in his image, he breathed his own life into us. So your breath is the breath of God. When you're holding these little babies, snuggling them close, their breath, that's the breath of God. And we're created in his image. That's unique. That's unlike anything else, any other creature on earth. And then he also gave us the ability to reason and to communicate using words. Now, there's something really interesting. Now, we're going to come back to that a little bit further on. But just to understand this, your life is a spirit that will never die. Your children are spirits that will never die. And God promises us that he has a place for those spirits in eternity with him when we trust in his son, Jesus, the Word. We'll get back to that again. So we participate in this earthly body, in this life, and we participate in the spiritual world. So we're both fully physical and we're both fully spiritual. And we unite heaven and earth in a way that neither the animals nor the angels can. So that's where I'm telling you, I'm just going to take you a little deeper there. So that's not going to help you when you are dealing with a temper tantrum with a 3-year-old. And you're like, you are a microcosm of the universe. Look like it. But the reality is, when you think about this, especially when you're thinking about the education of your children and the purpose of your children, we are powerfully created in the image of God. And we are so connected with this creation. So how does that deal with education? Well, we'll come back to that a little bit. And we're going to actually move on through our little historical, really fast overview. We're going to leave the ancients and we're going to move on because history is going to interject this conversation with the fall of Rome. And that's going to put a bit of a damper on all the deep think for a bit. The barbarians go around and they trample absolutely everything in sight, and thrones and kingdoms go swapping around, and things are happening at a really rapid pace, and nobody's really doing any of that deep thought anymore. But if you're like me, the question that I had was, what's happening to the books? The Romans being sacked. Their beautiful physical treasures, marbles and statues and all this is being completely destroyed. Where are the books? Where are the manuscripts? How did the Word of God survive that time and that period? Well, before the time of mass production of books and printing presses and the ability to have way too many books, that's even possible, there were scribes who copied books in order to reproduce them. And most of those scribes, they were monks in monasteries that were scattered across Europe. So the Christians understood the value of words and the value of these books. So they had taken as many of them as they could, and they put them in the quiet places of these monasteries so that these the monks could copy them. And in turn, take these copied books and move them to other parts of Europe so that they would have a greater chance of surviving. Now, you can imagine that with that kind of a slow production, like how long would it take to copy out the Bible? Like that's going to take a long time. And then they didn't just copy out the Bible. They actually copied out all the Greek works because they understood there's something about these works that's really important. And so it's almost like there was a natural selection among all the works that had been written up until then, where they had to decide what is of vital importance that we need to copy and preserve. So some of it was lost. We don't know what was lost, but you can imagine that if they're deciding, should we copy the Bible or should we copy Euclid's last thoughts on mathematics, they're going to drop the Euclid and they're going to go with the Bible. So we don't know what we lost, but we do know what we have. And we do know that through that time, they decided that what we have is really important. And it was the Christians that decided that alongside the translation of the Bible. So then it just begs the question, so what is it about these books? Why should we be reading these books? But it wasn't just the books that the Christians were preserving. It was actually an entire lifestyle. It was the teaching of virtue and cultivating just a humble living along with your neighbors, which back then could have been pretty treacherous. And so some of these monasteries, they would have gardens around them, and they would start taking care of the villages and the people around them and teach them how to be like Christians, but not necessarily like force them into Christianity, but just how to take care of themselves and how to be good people. One of my favorite stories is actually the story of Clovis and Clotilda of France. Has anybody heard of them before? So she was a Christian. She was taught to know her Latin and her Greek, and she knew theology very, very well. She read the Homer and Aristotle. She was very well educated, but it was the time of barbarian invasions, and so she was forced to marry the barbarian king of what we now know as France. It wasn't called France back then. It was the Franks, the Frankish people. And she decided that, well, clearly she had no choice. So she decided that then her calling was going to be to convert this man to Christianity. And as she's going there, she finds out that he beheaded a man because he broke a vase. So this is the guy she's going to go to. But she was scared, but she was not going to stand down. And she had the knowledge within her and the spirit within her to do this. And she talked with him and brought him the gospel constantly. When their first child was born, she begged him to allow the child to be baptized. And of course, he in his barbarian rage said, absolutely not. And by some miracle, he did relent and the child was baptized. 8 days later, the child died. You can imagine how that conversation went. So she has another child, the second child, and again, she's beseeching him to baptize this child. And back then, baptism was really, really important to infants. That's what the Christians did right away when these babies were born. And so it was so vitally important to her. And there actually did come a point where he relented and he allowed her to baptize that child again, and this child lived. And there just seemed to be this glimmer, this something that he could not let go of, and there was something he was listening to. And then in the twist of fate, he became the very first foxhole Christian. He was in one of his barbarian battles. Things were going badly for him, and they didn't often go badly. He was very successful in his campaigns, and he had a large kingdom, so he wasn't taking defeat very well. And so finally, in sort of this moment, he just shouts out and he says, "Okay, God of Clotilda, if you're really there, let me win this battle, and then I'll believe in you." And he won the battle. And he was true to his promise, and he converted to Christianity and went back home to Clotilda. And he was then willing to learn more about the faith and become a godly man, which was kind of never really refined, as I'm sure you can imagine. But they were known as the first Christian king and queen of Europe. And that was the very beginning of what was going to happen in Europe with Christianity. And I love that story because it just shows that tenacious, like holding to the truth, holding to the gospel. And we don't face anything remotely like having to be married to a barbarian. But if she could do that, then we should be able to at least teach our kids. I know it feels the same sometimes. Okay, so the barbarian rule obviously didn't prevail. Chaos never ever does, and Christianity slowly grew. And with it came a kind of peace in Egypt. France and England never figured it out. They were like your toddlers, always fighting. But as this kind of peace settled again, the ideas started to swirl some more. And they had all these books, and they had read all these books, and they picked them up and started to figure out, okay, what do we do with this stuff? And I was never quite able to figure out what really happened there. And then last month when Martin and Andrew were here, Martin Cawthorne, he sort of mentioned something in passing. I'm like, that's it. Martin said the medievals were the great organizers and the great sorters. So what the medievals did is they took this body of knowledge and they started to work with it. And the theologians of the day started to pick up some of the philosophy and decide, okay, this is truth and this is not truth. And the philosophies influenced a lot of the theology because it was truth, right? And we'll talk a little bit about that a little bit later too. So, but the biggest thing the medievals did is they sorted this body of knowledge into these two stages to help educate children. And the first thing they called the trivium, and that is what is used to study the primary ages, the younger children. And the second body of knowledge that they organized is called the quadrivium. And those are two terms that we know quite well today. We've heard them over and over. So rather than talking about those right now, we're going to jump into those a little bit later. But let's just move forward again one more time. So the education system that the medievals developed was very, very effective. But over time, what happened was that it was kind of only accepted by the elite. And it's not that it was accepted, but it was just difficult for like a mom in a mud hut just trying to pluck a chicken to teach her kid Latin. Like, that's not realistic. So they didn't, right? Right? See? It's possible. Hey, we could do it. We could do it. So we have washing machines. And we have washing machines, right? We have so much more nowadays that we have the time that they didn't have. But the reality is it was just not possible to go through all of this. Not only that, but these people couldn't afford the texts that was necessary to teach. So eventually this kind of education, it just stayed with the upper class, the nobility, the elites, and those who could hire tutors to teach their kids the Euclid's mathematics and things like that. And the parents just, especially in Victorian England, waltzed it out in high society. And that was kind of it was one of the saddest times for classical education, or back then it was just education, right? Until there was a young woman who came on the scene in the mid-19th century, and she started what I believe is the conversation we're still having today. Her name is Charlotte Mason. She's well known for her 6 volumes on education, and while she has her own ideas on how to teach children, they're all based on the education style that was being taught to the elite kids in that time, or what we would now call classical education. And the biggest principle that she put forward that was important is children are born persons, and implying that every single person deserves this kind of an education. It's not fair that only the elite are getting this. And it's not a kind of education that's only for the elite. Like these kids over here, they don't have the money or the brains, right? That's what's being implied. It's not true. Absolutely not true. It's for every single child. So, her books became actually very important, and they're still very important to this day. There's a kind of manual that we can refer back to on how to bring back the education of her day to our children today. And while there's a lot of, ups and downs between is Charlotte Mason classical, is classical Charlotte Mason, I stand firmly in the camp of, I believe Charlotte Mason was the last and the latest and most important voice in today's understanding and rediscovery of classical education. So another person that was that her name came to the rise in education in 1950 was Dorothy Sayers, and she wrote the book The Lost Tools of Learning. Actually, it wasn't a book. Now you have to understand, Dorothy Sayers was a character. She was part of the Inklings, so that was the group with C.S. Lewis and J.R. Tolkien. She was one of them. She would put on her trousers and smoke her pipe and sit down and discuss the ideas with them the Lord of the Rings and C.S. Lewis' Mere Christianity. She was in there. She was part of that. She became a single mother. She had a child out of wedlock, and back then that would have been quite something. And she eventually did get married, although not to the father of the child. So she was a cheeky woman. In fact, one of the essays she also wrote, so she writes The Lost Tools of Writing, but another essay she wrote is Are Women Human? So this tells you a little bit about this person who's going to now write this article or this essay on education. Okay, so we can't take that essay out of the context of her life and who she was, and the grit she had in the culture that she was living, that she flew in the face of every social convention. And then she writes this document on education. That document, though, that little talk, she actually delivered it at a dinner club. And she was a prolific writer. She actually wrote lots of mystery. That was kind of her genre, that thing. And in the end of her life, she was translating Dante into English. That was her one great life's work that she wanted to do. So she was very well classically educated. When she's writing this essay, it follows the trivium. It talks about the trivium, so grammar, logic, and rhetoric. And those of you who've read it probably know what I'm talking about here. But if you think about it, her description of those different stages, they're not actually an educational plan, right? They're a psychology of learning. She talks about grammar, the grammar stage, when you learn like the basics of education, or the basics of things, the parts of the whole, if you will. And she talks about how that's so appropriate for these little kids because all they want to do is memorize, and repeat. So she's right. She's absolutely right. And she supports this idea of the trivium, but she's not actually saying anything new or telling us how to educate. She's just telling us that, hey guys, you're doing a great job. I think she's right. Absolutely right. But I don't think that you can base an entire educational program on her little talk. as entertaining as it is. And I do highly recommend that you listen to it or read it. And of course, there are more names more recently in classical education. I think that in the last 20, 30 years, it's been blown wide open, and there's a lot of opinions and a lot of voices. And I think it's really important that we don't sort of latch onto any one person and decide, oh, I'm going to follow this person because I like what they say in classical education. We have to have a broad understanding. We have to read broadly, because like Christianity, just like Paul says, don't say I follow Apollos or I follow Paul. You follow Christ. So if we want to do a good job of educating our children, then we don't want to follow this person who says this is how you should classically educate, self included, or that person. We should be going out there and saying, well, what does he say about classical? What does she say about classical? Because we're going to get the general idea, right? Where all these voices align, that's something we definitely should be doing. So that's the one caution I would say about listening to the conversation going on now about classical education. But the very, very best way to find out about classical education and why we should do this is pick up your Bible, pick up Homer, read Plato, read Augustine, and read something in its entirety. Read all of Augustine's Confessions. Don't read excerpts here and there what somebody tells you to read. And let them speak to you as you're reading. Just like when you sit and read the Bible and you read through what Jesus is saying, you let him talk to you, right? There's times when people say, oh, this is what Jesus is saying, and this is how you have to think about it. Or they're going to say, okay, when you read Homer, this is what he's trying to tell you. And there's a place for all that. But before you let people tell you what it's saying, read it and let it tell you what it's saying. Let the author actually speak to you. That's why we call these curriculum conversations. And that's why we refer to the Great Conversation. Because all these books are voices of people who have gone through a certain period of time. And they have something to say. And they want to say it to you. So listen. And it's not as difficult as what you might think. It's sometimes a little intimidating. I subscribed to this plan called Plato in a Year once. I got pretty far. And the only reason why I did it was because I felt very intimidated about reading Plato. I'm like, this is like, people do this in like college and stuff, and I'm just a mom. But as I started reading, it was actually not hard at all. It was like, there was the wonkiest of wonky stuff in there sometimes. But there was really helpful things. So don't be intimidated. Because it's supposed to be for some highfalutin something somewhere. It's not. Okay, and the last caution I have on classical education is, as we learn more and we develop and our knowledge begins to grow, we need to fight hard against classical education snobbery. Because knowledge must bring humility. If we decide, oh, I know all this, I have this body of knowledge, and we've done all this, and we've read all these people, and we know, like, we could end up right back to the Victorian age where people think, oh, that way of studying is only for the elite. It's important that we allow ourselves to include others in this conversation, because it's for everyone, not just us. Okay, so where are we for time? Okay, let's try to go faster. Okay, because I really do want to talk about the quadrivium and the trivium, particularly the trivium. So any conversation about classical education has to include the trivium and the quadrivium. So the trivium is that first part of learning, the primary education that they'll receive, as I mentioned. And then after the trivium, then you move into this body of knowledge called the quadrivium, and that's more for the college or the high school level. And you really don't want to go into that until you've had a good understanding or an education through the trivium. So the trivium, the word trivium is actually a Latin word for three roads, or where the three roads meet. And teaching, so then the trivium is focused primarily on the study of language and how to use language. And so teaching, it helps us to teach a child to be a good communicator, unlike me right now. So the three roads of the trivium, they're called grammar, logic, and rhetoric. And so you can see how all those are terms that relate to language. So grammar then is the study of parts of a whole, or the elements of a body of knowledge. So in language, it's the structure of the language, or the parts necessary to use sentences and paragraphs. But it can refer to like any body of study. So if you were going to study the grammar of a tree, You would start with saying, this is the trunk, these are the branches, these are the leaves. That's the beginning part of a tree, right? So instead of saying to a child, we're going to study the molecular structure of this leaf versus this leaf, because it's important that you take the biology of, like, you've lost me and everyone else. We start with the grammar of a tree. These are the parts. And the grammar of the language. These are the parts. Then we move into the logic stage. And this is where Dorothy Sayers is really, really helpful too in understanding where do these stages apply and how do we teach the different things. So she can be really helpful in understanding these three roads. Logic is the process where we begin to think about the parts and their relationship to each other. And then we begin to be able to craft our own creation now, rather than just imitate or repeat, right? So if I'm saying, with language in particular, you're saying, well, what happens if I put these words together? Or what happens with this sentence structure or this sentence structure? And instead of just imitating the great writing, you start going, hey, I just wrote this beautiful piece of poetry. And you can do that because you've had so much good stuff put into you and you're drawing from this imagination that has a beautiful bank of knowledge, and you're putting now together your own beautiful creation. But the logic process is important, but that logic process is almost like that process where it's in like the incubator stage. They're still a little, they're intimidated. They can't put themselves out there, but they're starting to put things together, and it's really cool. And then there's the rhetoric part. The rhetoric part is the skill of communicating what you have learned in a way that is persuasive, knowledgeable, and well presented. Teenagers love the rhetoric stage. And if you haven't put some good information into their heads, it's going to come out as what? I want to go party with my friends tonight, or I'm going to wear these really ugly shoes, or I want to have this latest style of, because they're trying to express themselves. They're trying to tell you, hey, I'm here, guys, and I got a thing to say. But we haven't given them anything to say because we haven't filled them up with knowledge of what the world is about and how to use language, and then like given that time of incubation where they're learning how to fit all the pieces together so now they can put out their masterpiece. Mm-hmm. We really shouldn't be afraid of a teenager's rhetoric, right? Mm-hmm. We should be able to say to them, you want peanut butter and jelly for midnight snack, and you've been in bed and have your toothbrush. Tell me why. Give me your position, and give me a position on everything all the time. They want to go out partying with their friends, or they want to watch a movie that's off limits for your family. It's not, no, you can't watch that movie. It's, tell me why you want to watch that movie and how that movie would benefit you and be for the good of this family. Give me a paper. That's rhetoric, and they want to, right? They're up to the challenge. And this is partly why the first two stages are so important, because we're pouring in, and now what we've poured in is going to come back out again. So a well-crafted curriculum will follow those guidelines, and each step is going to build on the other so that a student can be an effective communicator and someone who's used language effectively. And this will also apply to the other parts of knowledge, like mathematics. So we're going to be teaching basic arithmetic, and we're going to be teaching science and all that. But the purpose of this is to teach them how to be communicators, because what would be the point of knowing quantum physics if you can't use words to get that knowledge out of your head and communicate it to other people? So so that's foundational, and that's kind of the technical part. But I kind of want to take you down this path. So I talked a little bit earlier about words and the importance of God giving us words and the ability to use words. So I'm just going to take you on a little bit of a tangent here. This is like something I've been thinking about for a while. If we go back to the very beginning to understand the importance of words, why we need to use words in language, the clearest explanation I can find is in the book of John, chapter 1, verse 1. Now listen to what this says. It says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. Did you get that? Did you? Yes, right? I've been this makes me so excited. Because the word begins with Jesus. And in fact, he is the word. Okay. And it was with words that the Trinity created and brought about you and me, right? We exist because of the words that he gave us to use. But it's actually even more than that, because words are actually the end of a process, the end of one process, and the beginning of another process. And we learn from Genesis that God the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, they existed outside of time before creation. They were a communion of perfect love, of perfect unity, and perfect harmony. And it was out of that perfection, you can almost imagine, it was so perfect, it was so awesome, it was so everything, that out of that, they had to create something to come into that, to enjoy that with them, to be a part with them. And so after that idea came about, you hear God say, let us create man in our image. There it is. There's the idea. That's the content, right? And what happens next? Well, then the word goes out. And the word, Jesus, he goes and he creates. And out of that, in that creation, that's you and me, is going to be drawn back into that creation, into that perfect love. Creation was not a spontaneous act of words. It was a thought out, perfectly organized, perfectly loved activity. So if that's who God is, and if that was his process to think and to have the idea and then to use words to create, think about us as human beings. That's what we do. We think, then we use words to create. And our words are powerful. They're far more powerful than we know, because we can use any word anytime, whenever we want, right? Freedom of speech is a dangerous thing. But this is also why we're microcosms of the universe. So if we go back to that idea where we are the perfect unity of the physical and the spiritual, we're microcosms of the universe. We were meant to be in perfect harmony with the Creator. We were meant to be that link that brought us in, like the creation was supposed to come in and be a part of that as well. And sin marred that relationship. We don't have that relationship with God that we should have had. And so God once again shows his great love, and he sends the word, and the word saves us from our own sin. Why? In order to bring us back in. The powerful idea, the idea is so powerful. Like, it's just that how can it be that God could love us with such perfection, and he would just keep reaching out and pulling us back in toward himself, right? And then not only that, he gives us the ability to do what he does, to be like he is, to be creators. And he says, come on, you guys, do the same thing, create, build worlds. And so as we're teaching our children, we're filling their minds with worlds. Are we doing this with this idea of God the Creator? Are we doing this with the idea that they will one day be going out there and speaking words, and they will be affecting worlds? Are they going to affect worlds for the better or for the worse? You see the purpose of the Trivium? You see why it is just so important, why I don't think it's a fad. So an example that came to mind, again, where we can kind of see the idea of philosophy tied into theology, is that passage in Matthew 10. And Jesus is calling his disciples to him. He's equipping them to go out into the world and to do this work. And up until that time, they'd only been witnessing it. They hadn't actually had to do anything. Now, imagine this. They've been in the presence of Jesus for several years, right? You imagine the school of Jesus. You're just going to watch him and listen to him. You get to ask him anything you want, whenever you want. They've done this for a while. That's the grammar of knowing God, right? So they're immersed into the Word made flesh. He's the light of man. And now he's going to send them out. Now they're beginning to doubt. Oh, but how do I know I can do these things? That's the logic of knowing God. To doubt is to test that. Like, but can I do this? And you know you can, because you're doubting it. If you didn't doubt it, then you wouldn't be there. And then finally, what does Jesus say? He says to them, do not worry. And do not worry what you're going to say. Because when it's time, the Holy Spirit will come upon you, and the words that you speak will be from the Holy Spirit. That's the rhetoric, knowing God, right? And then if you think about it, it just makes sense. Again, it goes back to this idea of creation. If you're living with Jesus for 3 years, and you're teaching your child this beautiful body of knowledge, and just pouring it in their minds, What's going to happen when somebody asks them a question? What are they going to draw from the answer? Well, the Holy Spirit's going to give them the words, but it's going to be drawn from that body of knowledge. For the disciples, it would have been from the last 3 years that they had knowing him intimately and personally. Like, how do you know this or that? And it would just be like, well, because Jesus did, and they just knew, right? And that's how the Holy Spirit works. So that's true for us too. It's true for our children. If we're putting them before Jesus, and when we send them out there, the Holy Spirit will be there to give them the words, and us as well. Now, I could go on for a while, but we're running out of time. So we'll quickly go over the quadrivium, which is also a medieval organization of education. So the quadrivium, I'm sure you can imagine, it means 4 roads. Yes. And they focus on mathematics. So the first part focuses on language, second part on mathematics. And the 4 roads are arithmetic, which is numbers in the abstract. Then there's geometry, which is numbers in space. And then there's music, which is numbers in time. And then there's astronomy, which is numbers in space and time. Isn't that just like mic drop? Okay, that's another evening. We could spend a whole evening on that. But I do want to talk just a little bit about where are we at? Okay, almost 8 o'clock. We're doing okay? Okay, I just want to talk a little bit about pedagogy. Pedagogy is really important to classical education. So pedagogy is from the Greek, and Paul actually refers to this in Ephesians as well. We want to teach like the pedagogy of God. So it's from the Greek word. It refers to an approach that we're taking to teaching. So we can embody like the space, the activities, the methods that we are using. But a pedagogy, it encompasses your whole being of the teacher and the being of the student. The idea is we're not just brains that need to be filled with data and spit out the tests. That's actually artificial intelligence. We're not that. We're so emphatically not that. We're human beings, and the whole of us has to be taught. And that's how we can consider and create a pedagogy to teach our own children. I think Charlotte Mason actually, she says it best when she says, education is an atmosphere, a discipline, a life. That is an educational pedagogy. So how can we be intentional about that? This is why I'm going to go a little bit into the humanities because we're not going to have time to talk about that, but this is why the humanities are so vitally important. A good pedagogy will have good classical art, it will have good music, it will have good food, and it will be able to touch all aspects of your child's mind and soul and body in ways that tie them to the truth and to the beautiful and to the good. The classical art, especially if you view it through history, through time, and you look at some of the ancient artists, and you just kind of go and look at this, and as you go, you see the spiritual disappear. Like the little angels in the corner at the beginning. They're quite big in the images with the ancients, and they get smaller and smaller, and then they're just kind of in the corner, and then all of a sudden they're gone. And my children were like, what's happening? And you can see us move away from that idea that we are spiritual creatures, and the reality of the spiritual world around us constantly at all times is it's being lost in the secular world. They don't see that anymore, but that doesn't mean it's not true. So art can have an incredible impact. And then conversations with your children are like, that's the goal. All the reading and all the viewing of art and listening to music in the world, that's the input, right? And it's important. But those conversations where you're helping them to see the connections and tie it all together, that's the goal. And that can be done, I don't know about you guys, but for us, it's when I'm driving. Like we all get in the van, we go somewhere and say, Mom, and here we go. And it goes, and it's just everywhere. Another time is when I'm cooking dinner. I like to have the kids with me when I'm cooking dinner. Not everyone does, but I like this because even if they're chopping cucumbers that I don't need, it's that we're doing something with our hands, and they're not, like, you can't sit a child down and look them deep in the eyes and say, tell me. doesn't work. They're not going to talk. So that idea of creating a place, like a home that is a place where everything around you is learning. If I think about the time after the fall of Rome, and I've already told you the story, one of my favorite stories about Clovis and Clotilde, but then I think about that time, and then you can kind of contrast that to where we are today, barbarians and AI, and it just seems sometimes like they have the upper hand. But then I think through this idea of education, and I think through this tie and connection that we have with a conversation that's been going on for 2,000 years, and that we can listen to and even be a part of in today's day and age, because it was Christianity, it was the gospel that held it all together through the whole time, and it was the Christians who knew that they had to like hold on to the books, like save the books, put the books in a place where they will be safe and where people can find them, and it was the monasteries that they took care of those books, but they didn't just take care of books, they took care of the people in the villages around them. And they grew huge amounts of vegetables and food because they had to feed the people around them, and they took care of them. And then like the faithfulness of a woman like Clotilda. And she was well educated. She was not just going to marry this barbarian and hope for the best. She went in there, she was educated, she knew the conversation of the day, she knew what to say to him, she knew how to get to him. So when I compare that to today, I think we have something similar happening. We don't have monasteries right now, but what we do have are faithful mothers and fathers pulling their children out of the schools, out of the public areas where it's kind of nasty these days, and we're just going to teach them the truth. And I think what I see is that we have what I like to call domestic monasteries. It's been upgraded. And I'm so encouraged because each of these homes we're teaching the word, and the word is the light of man, and the darkness cannot put out the light. And I'm going to end there because otherwise I could go on for a very long time. So why don't we do you have any questions? Way too many? Yeah.
We're gonna have to do like a whole Q&A.
I know, right? Do you do private bookings? I do, actually.
I have a question.
Go for it.
So if this is the first time I'm hearing of classical education,
Yes.
and my children are in grade 4 and grade 2, where do I get started?
Right where
I
you
feel
are.
like there's a okay.
Just jump in.
Just go.
For many of us adults,
Yeah.
we're just getting started,
Okay.
right? Like I'm looking at this and I'm going, well, how can I do this? And so for yourself, like as for yourself, find like there's actually a collection of works from the great books. It's called The Great Tradition by Richard Gamble, and it's just you just read through kind of excerpts of all of these great writers, and it's what I told you not to do because I said read the whole thing, but in a pinch, read the excerpts of these, and just start with it yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Like clearly, we're already steeped in the Word of God. That's the first step, and that's what we've always done, and so we already have the right foundation, right? Next thing we should do is start reading some of these classics. Put some art in your home, classical art in your home. Just put on a little bit of classical music. Start bringing the humanities into your home, and the conversations go.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. Anyone else? Because otherwise there's more treats. Yes.
What artist should you start with?
What artist? Well, that's a good question. What would you think? Do you have an opinion? What's your favorite? Put it this way, from your experience, do you think it would be helpful to start with more of a modern artist or with an ancient artist?
The older ones.
The older ones. Okay. So probably, yeah, pick your artist probably from the ancients, And then what we did in our home, which I loved and thought was effective, was start with the ancients and every year choose 6 artists from the ancients to the modern and just watch the pictures change. And the story just tells itself.
Kyoto, that's the one to start with Kyoto.
Giotto? Giotto? Okay, start with Giotto, she said. Anyone else? Okay, with that, thank you so much for joining me today. And we're gonna do our drawing.
Yes.
Okay.
So you need to, I'll just pass this around. There's a pen in there. And
Okay.
just put your name on there. First and last name. And then
Now for our live audience, do you want to, we'll close our live audience and then we'll put any winners in the chat
Never
box.
done this one.
Yeah. Yep.
Actually, you can look at the We've never had this one. I did that. I like that.
It's like being hit by a really good truck.
So Adrienne, she's like, are you gonna do this? I'm like, I don't know. I'm just gonna say it. You want
They're very good. Are you coming Saturday?
Yeah.
Kind of listening in, I was like,
It's so proud of it.
Yeah.